Maksumihet on edition. Ja, ni wahtu. Hollywood seems to believe that when things have gone seriously wrong with a franchise for long enough, the answer is simply to start over again at the last point that all the fans agree was a strong point. This decision is problematic, however, because it splinters the fan base. So when Halloween 2018 decided to retcon all but the original film, they really going back to the safest possible place they could if they were going to eliminate chapters. Basically, just eliminate it all. However, doing that had a heavy cost on both the fan base and the ultimate long-term reception of this entry. I want to be clear, this film was very popular upon release, and I was definitely in the minority saying that there was serious problems with this film and that it probably didn't even rise to middle of the pack in the entire Halloween franchise. But I'm not one to really double down on my opinion. There's been plenty of films that have gotten better on rewatch, and there's plenty of films in my life that have gotten worse upon rewatch. In fact, I can even say that there was a time in my life when I used to think that something like The Wolfman was one of the best Universal properties. I loved the original film. However, as I've watched it more, it has sunk further and further down my list of not just Universal films, but films of that period in general, to the point where today I never have the inclination to watch The Wolfman. I recognize its status and what it did for the genre, at least for iconic visuals, but I don't love the film like I used to. On the other hand, there's been films like the Blob remake, which I didn't like a whole lot when I saw it originally in theaters. It seemed, well, kind of cheap and plastic compared to the original, which was also cheap and plastic, but was a lot of fun. The new film took itself kind of serious, and it seemed just a little bit too much like a stage play, whereas everything was telegraphed a little bit too loudly so that people in the back row were sure to get it. Now, that was my impression when I saw the film, and I think a lot of times when you walk into a theater or even just turn on a VCR or DVD player, Blu-ray player, 4K player, or a streaming service, sometimes you come in with a mindset, and that mindset can definitely affect the film you're about to watch. I think that's what happened to me with the Blob remake, because since then I've grown to like the film quite a lot. Now, I still don't see it being on par with the great remakes of the 80s, your Fly or your Thing. But I do think it is a solid enough film, and it is worthy of the original. So when I walked in to see Halloween 2018, I was away from home. I was ready to enjoy it. And I just 2 weeks earlier vastly enjoyed a little slash film I knew nothing about called Hellfest that hit theaters. And I was still kind of buzzing off that. I thought this was going to be the best month for slasher films since the heyday. Because I didn't see how, based on the trailer for Halloween 2018, I was going to walk out the door with less than glowing feelings for the film. Now, I will tell you, I always take these things a step at a time, and I'm never exactly sure where I'm going to come out, but I had positive feelings about this movie. They wouldn't, unfortunately, last very long. Structurally, Halloween 2018 is basically just Halloween H2O reset in Haddonfield, as if the town was so important that they needed to make sure that they got all the classic ingredients of the first film back in place. But in structure, it's really not much different, except that Laurie has a different family, and of course the setting and the time period. So there's lots of technology on hand that was not available when they made H2O. But those two films, H2O and 2018, will forever be in competition with each other, mainly because they are so similar. And just like H2O suffers from looking too much like that late 90s Scream aesthetic, Halloween 2018 looks way too obnoxiously like 2018. It doesn't have the gravitas that the wonderful score tries to imbue it with. In fact, mostly it just looks like the Rob Zombie movies without fast cutting and dialed back a little bit so the dialogue is not as profane. But aesthetically, it owes a lot more to the zombie films than it does to John Carpenter's original. In fact, I'd say it owes a lot more to Rick Rosenthal's Halloween 2 in its feel than it does the original as well. So for a film that erased the entire franchise except for the first film, it actually takes remarkably little from that first picture. The film opens introducing two characters who are kind of narrating to the audience where we are now. Through them, we see that Michael Myers is institutionalized, and we grow to understand that the series didn't happen. We also find out where Laurie Strode is. She lives in a compound just outside Haddonfield, apparently, which again, as I referenced in H2O, doesn't make a lick of sense. If she was as badly traumatized as this film has us believe, there's no chance that the intelligent character that Laurie Strode was in the original film would have stayed anywhere near that town. I don't think any of the people affected probably would have. And the film uses these two web journalists as an excuse to introduce us to all these elements and to lay the groundwork. But as soon as the film is done with them, because it's not really interested in these characters, it basically just shuffles them off the stage by killing them off in a recreation of a scene straight out of Halloween H2O. It's a weird place to start for a film that's supposed to be righting the wrongs of the last several sequels, but also just erasing the franchise, to start so blatantly referencing early films and entire sequences are recreated. It's an odd choice, and it feels, frankly, not so much like an attempt at nostalgia, but just plain laziness. With those characters out of the way, we're now introduced to Laurie Strode and her alcoholism and her family struggles. She's become deeply separated from her daughter and her daughter's family. And there's really good reason for her to be like that, because she's absolutely horrible to them. She's basically just a paranoid schizophrenic. And that's really depressing. I mean, that's not an angle that I would have done for Laurie Strode, because I think she was a stronger character than that, but I accept it if they wanted to go that route. Unfortunately, they want it both ways. They want her to be loony grandma Strode, but they also want her to be the relatable one who really knows what's going on. At this point, it should also be noted that only the female characters in this film are ever completely competent or good. All the male characters are portrayed as completely flawed, if not outright evil. And that's a sign of 2018, whereas there's a certain level of political awareness to a film and how it's structured. It's beyond obnoxious, actually. In this film, we actually introduce characters just for the matter of making sure that we have enough faces who look different on screen. That's going to be a problem if that's the way this trilogy goes. Because Halloween at its core can be whatever we want it to be, but it can't be everything to all people. The original certainly wasn't. It's easy to forget that the original Halloween was not a robust critical favorite when it came out. It enjoyed some positive reviews, but in general it was thought of as a dirty horror film. This film struggled through production, and all the seams of its many reshoots and recalibrations and ADR, they're all very obvious. Maybe on that first watch, when everyone was just excited to have Michael Myers back on screen, it was easier to overlook, but on subsequent viewings, it's just so blatantly obvious this film was Frankenstein together with a dull needle and some translucent thread. It doesn't follow a narrative path that actually makes any logical sense. If you erase the second film and Michael Myers and Laurie Strode are no longer brother and sister, then the fact that he ends up back at her house where she didn't live during the first film, and he has no way of knowing that he would end up there. He's no reason to stalk her or even the means to do so. It just comes off as a huge coincidence. He follows characters but arrives before them. He seems to be everywhere the plot needs him to be for an emotional beat to take place. And let's talk about that for a second. The movie seems very concerned with trying to have a certain amount of emotional resonance that we really have never gotten in any of the Halloween films, including the original. It tries to weaponize our nostalgia to make us care more deeply about these characters and the situation than we probably would otherwise. And it really falls horrifically flat for me. And the reason it does so is we can't really relate to Laurie Strode anymore. The character she is just not a good person. She wants to prepare her family for Michael's return, and that sounds noble, but the problem with that nobility is she wastes her entire relationship with her family. Now at the end, we're led to believe that the family are finally understand and they're going to come back to her. But does that justify all of the things she does? She gets invited to dinners and shows up drunk. She's rude. She's obnoxious. She forces herself into houses in hysterics. There's just better ways for someone who has this knowledge to do this. And the series actually knows this because that is Dr. Loomis. Dr. Loomis at his most insane had a nobility and a reasonableness about him. Even in part 5 and 6, where he's pretty far into his obsession, he still has certain boundaries that he won't cross. Even when he holds a gun up to a sheriff's deputy in part 2, you and I know, and I think the deputy knows, that he's not actually going to just murder a law enforcement officer. We don't get that same sense of caution from Laurie. She's just not relatable in her obsession or in her insanity. Now, there's a subplot with I don't know if I want to call him a substitution for Dr. Loomis, or this is a psychiatrist character that's after Michael again, but is fascinated with Michael. And Dr. Sartain is just, it's straight out of a Rob Zombie movie. His final sequence is so underdeveloped and so just frankly badly done and laughable. There's a moment in the theater where people burst out laughing during this switcheroo. And it's even more frustrating because the film doesn't have the stick-with-itness to actually just live through its decision. It's just this blip on the screen that's meant to, I don't know, misdirect the audience into worrying that the movie's going to go off the rails. But it doesn't need to do this because the movie immediately then goes off the rails for its final showdown at Laurie Strode's house, where Laurie Strode has built a trap for Michael Myers, which is absurdly improbable. The amount of things she has to do and the situation she has to put herself into for her trap to work is not just absurd, it's criminally negligent about everyone else she puts in danger. The film ends really with just a recontextualized version of the end of Halloween 2. A film it again didn't see worthy of including, but decided to basically make a huge nod to the fiery end. So I walked out of Halloween 2018 looking at this messy, unresolved film that felt horrifically incomplete. And I was so baffled to speak with other genre fans who were declaring it the best since the original. My favorite sequel, I heard so often. It's funny because as time has gone by, you hear that a lot less and less. The film's reputation in just a couple years has already sunk significantly. And that's the thing that happens with these Halloween sequels. They tend to come out and they have a level of popularity and then it falls. H2O, when it came out, was extremely popular with the fan base, and over time it settled. Halloween 4 as well. Initially, it was pretty much loved by everyone, and then a couple years later, you start to see people say, well, maybe not, maybe it has its problems. So the series has this history of elevating and then cutting a film down to where it ultimately will be in most people's standings. Even the really bad chapters, your Rob Zombie films and your Halloween Resurrections, when they came out, were better regarded than they ultimately would be. I'm not going to tell you this is my least favorite Halloween, because it has a lot going for it. It's really well made, except for its reshoots undoing its structure, of course. But all the tech credits are really high, and there's a lot to like about this movie. I think Jamie Lee Curtis does well, but the role is written completely incorrectly. It is written on a level of action star, like a pseudo Ripley. And it doesn't feel deserved or earned. It's just where they wanted to go to give you those images of empowerment. It also has a great score, although I think sometimes that gets a little bit overplayed by people. It's a really good score, but the series has a lot of really good scores, and including in some pretty horrible films. So I can't give it that much credit. As a whole, all the individual pieces seem to be trying to build to something worthwhile for the Halloween franchise, but it doesn't get there. In fact, when you assemble these pieces, what you get is a film that seems to be trying to sabotage itself. Halloween 2018 is a table with at least one really wobbly leg. How you see the film will vary based on how much you're willing to overlook. I think, though, at this point, in a franchise like this, either we shouldn't make these movies anymore and let the old films stand on their own without some modern complement so that they can merchandise action figures and t-shirts, or something bold needs to happen and we have to let go of the past. This film wrote out all the sequels but the original, but yet couldn't escape all of the cliches of those films. And it did so brazenly, even putting references on screen to those movies. I hope you enjoy Halloween 2018. I don't. I do understand those people who see it as a triumph, though I disagree. Ultimately, I think it's the best reason why we need to put these old slasher franchises on ice. There's nothing that's going to come out that's going to increase the greatness of the originals. And at this point, the best it can do is hope to keep the property fresh for a generation that have not found it yet. But that generation deserves their own titles that speak directly to them. And maybe I will detest every one of those films, but I would rather the generation that's growing up on Terrifier and Happy Death Day to have their own thing and to build this genre for themselves. We did that. We had our opportunity. The generation that came up with Halloween and Friday the 13th were not the future. Let the future be the future. And let's stop slapping names onto projects when really new, creative enterprises would really be so much better for the genre at large. I want to thank all of you who stuck with me through this entire series of autopsies for the Halloween franchise. I don't know that I want to do another big franchise ever again. It's a lot of work, and I realized while making this that I really don't have the appetite for any of these long series. I would rather do individual films that I think are worthy of real deep discussion. So that's probably where I'll go next with the Autopsy series. But I want to thank you for sticking with me, and I hope you have an amazing Halloween.